But in talking about who won and who lost, there's a part of this that I don't think a lot of people are talking about. And that's the ever-changing political environment in this country. What are we going to do in a situation where the political climate in Idaho changes so drastically they rewrite their laws on what a life sentence is? It was 249 years ago to this day our founding fathers set out to build a nation in which the government worked for the people. And there's loads of irony in that when you look at the situation surrounding the Idaho 4 and Bryan Kohberger. So honestly, who won? What happened? And is this justice? Plus my final thoughts on this situation at the end. All that being said, everything's alleged. Welcome to the point. Let's get the intro and just get right to it. There's a legitimate conversation to be had amongst our lawmakers about attorneys in situations like this treating people's lives like real estate transactions. And we have to ask ourselves, what happened in this situation? From very early on in this situation, it seemed like Moscow was aware that they were in over their head. They called in the sheriff's office, they called in the state police, and they called in federal authorities to help them solve this crime. They would give those infamous non-informational press conferences, but reassured everybody they were doing everything they could, they were going to get this thing solved. And when Bryan was announced as a suspect, Bill Thompson came out there and gave his press conference, went through the probable cause affidavit. Things continued to be sealed, but it came out that he was going to charge Bryan with 4 counts of first degree with the DP. And even though they would lose a whole lot of these arguments up front very early on in this case, they showed no sign of letting up. To the best of my knowledge and everyone else's knowledge, there was no talk of a plea deal. They were going to see this thing through. What happened in Moscow was a tragedy. What happened in that state was a tragedy, and they weren't going to let this slide. They continuously argued and fought over absolutely everything that Bryan's defense team would file, regardless of how ridiculous it was. They gave the appearance that they weren't going to give up anything. They were going to fight for every single inch of ground that they had to fight for. And Dan Taylor would do the same, winning all those key arguments very early on until this thing ended up in front of Judge Hippler. And I know her motions and arguments upset a lot of people, but you have to understand, you are not going to get justice in a situation like this unless a defense attorney is doing their job. I have no problem with the defense attorney fighting and being zealous when it comes to the representation of their client. That's what you want. You're only going to get justice if both the state and the defense are doing their jobs and they're doing it to the best of their ability. And it's a fair question to ask at this point. Did Ann Taylor know? Did she know Bryan was going to plead guilty? Did she know that Bryan was interested in a plea? And if she knew, what does that say about her filing the motion for alternative suspects? I mean, once again, I get it. Argue and fight for your client and do everything within your power to ensure they're getting a fair and transparent trial. But if she knew Bryan was interested in a plea and that he would plead guilty, that gives me some mixed feelings when you start talking about them filing that motion for alternative suspects, because make no mistake about it, this case absolutely drug a whole lot of people through the mud. You had commentary and videos about the surviving roommates, the Jacks, Adams, all the people that surrounded the home. And if that motion would have been granted, there would have been other individuals whose names would have came out during this trial, and it would have happened to them as well. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, a lot of that could have been avoided if Moscow would have just been a little bit more transparent.
To be honest, you're going to have to trust us on that at this point, because we're not going to release why we think that.
Maybe if Idaho wouldn't have sat there and sealed everything, a lot of this circus could have been tempered down a little bit. But either way, both the prosecution and the defense showed no signs of letting up. They showed no signs of quit, and they both seemed like they were going to take this thing to the very end. And then we get that announcement on Monday afternoon that a plea deal has been struck, which sent the news cycle into a frenzy. Nobody saw this coming. And honestly, what happened? Now, reports would indicate that after all this stuff was said and done, Bryan was looking at the situation and he said he didn't want his family to go through and testify. He was going to do this plea to spare his family, which is strange when you look at what happened during that most recent plea hearing, because Bryan's parents were there. Bryan's parents were sitting right behind him. And I can see no reports or in any video where he acknowledged their presence. He didn't look at them, he didn't smile. He walked in, sat down, and that was that. Other people had said that a plea deal was struck simply because there were holes in both sides of the argument. There is an idea that there was holes in Bill Thompson's case, holes that he was worried he couldn't necessarily overcome, and the same for Ann Taylor in the defense. And because both sides saw holes, there was an agreement made to pull the DP off the table and Bryan would plead guilty to all these charges. But is there justice in this situation? Now, I understand justice means something different for everybody. Some people will look at this, like half of the victims' families, and say, hey, we don't have to go through this trial. We don't have to relive that horrific night. He's going to go to jail. He's pleading guilty. He won't get parole. He will do multiple life sentences, and he will take his last breath while sitting in a prison cell. On the other hand, there's the other half of the family who wanted Bryan to face a jury of his peers. They wanted all this information, all this evidence, and the whole story, or at least the whole story as it could be presented, to come out so everybody knew who did what. They were willing to risk it all for a chance that Bryan would stare down the end of a barrel. And as far as those families are concerned, Bryan's alive, their children are gone, and they want Bryan to meet the same fate as their kids. To them, that's what justice is. And the general public seems to be split on both ways. Some people are fine with it. They don't understand why people are upset. And what's interesting here in this particular part of the conversation is this seems to be the one thing that's got a lot of people aggravated. I mean, there are individuals who from the very beginning believed Bryan committed this crime and they wanted him to face capital punishment. And that's been denied from them. There's other people upset who saw Bryan as innocent. This caught them by surprise. They wanted him to have his day in court to prove his innocence. They championed his innocence online. And they're upset because they feel like they've been lied to. And then there's a group of people who had reasonable doubt or were just waiting for more information. They wanted to try to figure out what the motive was. They wanted to figure out how this happened. They wanted to make sense of a situation that didn't seem to make sense in the mainstream media. So in a lot of ways, all sides of this particular discussion online have had some sort of part of this story denied from them. But in talking about who won and who lost, there's a part of this that I don't think a lot of people are talking about. And that's the ever-changing political environment in this country. See, as it stands right now, life sentence is whatever the life sentence in Idaho because that's what the state legislature deems that life sentence to be. Life without the possibility of parole is legal in the state of Idaho because that's the law of the state. But is anybody considering the fact that we can't predict 2 years from now what individuals in the state are going to do, much less 5, 10, or 15? What are we going to do in a situation where the political climate in Idaho changes so drastically they rewrite their laws on what a life sentence is? They rewrite the laws on if an individual can get life without parole. I mean, these are ever-changing things within our judicial system. And I'm not quite sure Bill Thompson accounted for that. We see it all the time in this country. States removing the DP off the table. Or they're changing the total years of what a life sentence would be. Or they're saying, hey, you cannot do a full life sentence without the possibility of parole. It happens all the time. What are we going to do in that situation if all of a sudden Idaho changes its entire political environment? And now 15, 20 years down the road, Bryan's looking at a situation where he could get parole. He's going to be walking around in general population with a body count higher than most individuals who are currently awaiting capital punishment. So honestly, who won in this situation? The state is going to say they got the guaranteed victory. They're going to say they got the conviction. They're going to claim that they won because Bryan's going to be locked behind bars without any possibility of parole because that's what the laws are right now. And they can spare the family a brutal and horrific trial. They can spare the taxpayer the money that they spent on this thing already. On the opposite end of that, Ann Taylor could claim some sort of victory here. When you look at this situation, according to the state, they had anything and everything they needed to prove Bryan committed this crime. They were determined to get the DP. They were never going to take the DP off the table, and she was able to do that. That will be something she can put on her resume or some sort of website if she ever becomes a private attorney and starts doing mostly private cases. Look what I did. My client was in this horrific situation. This is what he was staring at, and this is what I was able to do. And having covered all those questions on both particular sides, at least the best of my ability, because this is simply an open discussion channel, I got to give my thoughts on the situation. Legitimately, I'm pissed, and I think down the road, this will go down in history as one of the most brutal, horrific crimes in the state of Idaho, possibly the country, with the biggest judicial blunder at the end of it. If the state had everything they claim to have, but gave up the farm just to strike this deal, that is absolutely a spineless prosecutor, in my own unprofessional opinion. You can feel free to disagree at any point, but I'm agreeing with Steve. The state got spineless in this situation. The battle was coming up and their knees got shaky. The defense reached out to them, hey, let's strike a deal, and they jumped on it. Not only did they jump on it, they gave us nothing in return. We are no closer today to having any answers in this particular situation than we were at the very beginning of this thing. All Bryan had to do was sit up there and just say, yes, I'm guilty of this. Yes, I'm guilty of that. Yes, I'm guilty of that. And give no reasons, no explanation, or no understanding to the why or the how. I mean, you heard Bill Thompson. There was no known connection between Bryan and those 4 victims or that home. How did he pick his targets? There's no proof that he was the only one who committed this crime other than him just simply admitting guilt. So speculation is still going to run. Did Bryan commit this crime? 100% he did. He committed this crime. He confessed. He admitted it in open court. He wasn't under duress or any type of substance like Richard Allen was. He wasn't placed in solitary confinement and lockdown and 24-hour supervision. These situations are night and day. He confessed to these crimes because he did these crimes. And that's just how I'm going to see it. I understand it's going to upset a lot of people. I can't sit here in this video and explain how he committed this crime by himself in that title window. I don't have any of those answers. We weren't given any of those answers. I can't explain a motive because none was provided, not even an inkling of one. But Bryan wasn't under duress. He wasn't forced to confess to these crimes. I understand the argument that a lot of this doesn't make sense, that this was a forced confession because there's a bigger mystery at play here. But here's why I'm going to disagree with that. Now, this isn't me sitting here trying to make the argument that I'm right, you're wrong, but this is just how I'm seeing it. Yes, innocent people do plead guilty for crimes. Yes, innocent people do take plea deals. I'm not making that particular argument in this video. But innocent people only take plea deals when the sentence is reduced. I mean, there's something major given up here. Maybe it's house arrest, or maybe it's a drastic reduction in the sentence. But the only thing removed in this particular story was the DP. So what is the difference here? I mean, either way, you're going to take your last breath in prison. So that doesn't make sense. To me, that isn't a plea deal worth taking unless you're getting the one thing you want, which is to circle back with Bryan actually won this thing. That's just my take on it. But here's why I'm saying what I'm saying. Within the narrative of this story, there's only one individual who got to determine who stays and who leaves. And that was Bryan Kohberger. I mean, for some unexplained reason, the fact that he stood up when Judge Hippler was talking to him and showed respect to Judge Hippler while not respecting the lives of those 4 individuals, that just absolutely pissed me off. And I'm not buying that he had some sort of great concern about his family. He didn't acknowledge them during that hearing. And I don't know if Ann Taylor knew all this throughout this whole process, or if this was just something Bryan kept in his back pocket. Maybe this was just something he was saying, all I want is the DP removed off the table. As soon as I can get that, I'll confess. Maybe he kept that to himself. Or maybe he did share that with the attorneys. But either way, he understood that there was holes in the story, and he played the state in this particular situation. He's going to continue to decide who stays and who goes. He's going to pull that decision out of the public. And I know people are saying, well, when he gets to prison, he's going to suffer, he's going to pay. But I strongly encourage everybody to watch Jumpsuit Pablo's video on the subject. In fact, it'll be on one of the ending cards at the end of the video. He's got a completely different take that's going to upset a lot of people. But when I'm looking for information and answers on a particular subject, I'm not going to go by a legal analyst or a talking head. I'm going to go by the information of somebody who's been in the prison system. Bryan's controlling the narrative here. Bryan has all the power here. He knows as long as he doesn't give any type of motive or explanation, people will constantly seek his attention. That makes him important. That gives him what he's wanted this whole time. I mean, the situation as a whole is an absolute crap ending. If he doesn't give a motive, if he doesn't give an explanation, we're not getting anything. We're not getting justice. We're not getting a resolution. And that's just my take. You can feel free to disagree at any point in time. And if you enjoyed this and a more fair, open conversation, maybe check one of these videos out. Y'all be safe now.